Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm White Pointer, and I hope you're ready for another video where I answer questions submitted by you about how classic games pulled off their graphical tricks. In this episode we'll be looking at the Nintendo Entertainment System and Game Boy Color for the first time, returning to the Sega Master System, and covering some more material from the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo. If you want to play along, why not try to guess the answer before it's revealed? Let's get right into it. To start this video off, we're going to make our first visit to the Game Boy Color with this question from Ray VGM. This was for a game that was only released in Germany called... look, I'm not going to try to pronounce that because I'll probably botch it, so let's go for a translation. The Secret of Happy Hippo Island. He says that if you play the first stage, you'll notice that the sky in the background has a gradient and there are gaps in the clouds. When you jump, this causes the gradient to move independently from the clouds. How's the GBC doing that if it only has one background layer? Let's make a splash and check it out. Here's the game in action. According to Strategy Wiki, it's a licensed game based on the Happy Hippo characters that could be found inside Kinder Surprise chocolate eggs. Apparently the characters were very popular in Germany, so it was only released there and all the text is in German, though there isn't much of it. As you can see, it's a pretty basic platformer. There isn't too much to the gameplay except dodging enemies and spitting water at fires to put them out, which can be replenished by finding pickups. If anyone can explain why the hippos are wearing pink undies, actually never mind, I don't want to know. The question is asking about that background gradient you can see in most of the game's outdoor levels, like the first few stages here. You'll notice the clouds in the terrain seem to be moving independently of this background gradient, which would easily be explained if there were multiple background layers in use, but as the question correctly points out, the GBC only had one background layer. So you might be thinking, well that's just a backdrop colour, but the GBC didn't have a dedicated backdrop colour like the home consoles did either. It's just one single background layer, though tiles could be specified to be low or high priority so the player can pass in front of or behind them respectively, so you could kind of simulate having two layers that way. But the priority system isn't being used to make this effect. The gradient itself is created using HDMI interrupts to change the colour on a per scanline basis. It's just one single colour index that's changing here, index B of palette 1. Every tile that uses this palette index will have this gradient on it rather than a solid colour. Importantly though, this gradient doesn't change as the rest of the background scrolls up and down. For any tiles using this palette index, these scanlines will always show the gradient. The rest of the colours in the palette do not change at all and act normally. This creates the illusion of multiple vertically parallaxing background layers. Sometimes, neat tricks like this come from the most unlikely of places. Alright, let's move on to another platform we'll cover for the first time, and that's the Nintendo Entertainment System. Kirby Super wants to know how the force beams were done in Quick Man stage in Mega Man 2. They aren't all sprites, but look so smooth to only be tiles. Well, let's quickly drop in to see what's going on. I take it everyone has at least heard of Mega Man 2, even if you haven't played it. It's considered one of the best in the series, despite the box art of the international release still being awful. Seriously, I don't know why they decided to make Mega Man look like that. Here's Quick Man stage, and the main gimmick of this one is that it's full of these force beams that push out from the walls like compactors and cause an instant death if you touch them. It's a pretty smooth animation, so the question is asking, are they sprites or are they background tiles?
¿Por qué no los dos?
Yeah, believe it or not, it's both. The front part of the force beams are made up of sprites, and they are animated to travel left or right every frame. The rest of the beams are made up of background tiles, with new tiles being added to them every 2 frames to lengthen them. This is why the animation looks so smooth. The sprite part of the beams, as you can see, are actually made up of a 2x2 grid of tiles, but they only move half a tile width per frame. Every second frame, the background portion updates to add a 1x2 column of whole tiles to the beams, which the sprite parts cover up quite nicely as it happens behind them. Pretty clever. Other games, such as Battletoads, also use this trick, although in this case the movement is even more fine as the sprites move just 1 pixel every frame, then the background tiles update once they have moved 8 pixels or a full tile's width. It actually goes back and forth one way and then the other too, so it's also removing tiles on the other side at the same time. For this next question, we're returning to the Sega Master System, because Monozone Tilted 4499, Bill Niot, and Eleanor Burns 8686 all had the same question about the original Phantasy Star. They want to know how the first-person dungeons work, and whether there's actually any kind of real-time 3D going on. Let's crawl on in to discover the secrets inside this. In case you aren't familiar with it, Phantasy Star was an RPG for the Master System that used a mixture of 2D top-down overworld and towns, and first-person interiors and dungeons. Inspired by Western RPGs like Wizardry, it was pretty revolutionary for the time, because unlike those games, the movement and turning in the game's interiors was really fast and smooth. Yuji Naka was the brains behind the game's code, and he'd go on to become best known as the co-creator of Sonic the Hedgehog, but he was also responsible for the Master System ports of some of Sega's arcade games, like Outrun and Space Harrier. So the questions are asking about these first-person dungeons, and when you consider that this is running on the Master System, an 8-bit console, with silky smooth movement like this that wasn't even common on PCs at the time, it's pretty damn impressive. This has all been drawn to the Master System's single background layer. If we take a look at the tiles, we can see they are animated to create the movement you see when walking forward or backward or turning around. So that's it then? Just animated tiles? Well, no, there's more to it than that. The tile data is actually stored compressed in the ROM, and when the player moves in their specific direction, it grabs the appropriate tiles for the animation from the ROM and decompresses them into VRAM. Once all the tiles are loaded in, it updates the background tile map. It actually alternates copying and decompressing the data between the upper 8KB and the lower 8KB of VRAM, using it as a kind of frame buffer. It does this several times for each frame of the animation until it's complete. This process takes some time, resulting in the image updating once every 6 frames when in motion, so it's happening at 10 frames a second. But honestly, when the game is running at full speed, it looks way faster than that. You'll also notice that stuff like doors aren't seen during the animations, and only pop in later after the animation is complete. This is because they are not part of the tiles making up the animation and are loaded in separately. What's actually interesting is that the initial version of this that Naka wrote didn't have the decompression routine, as the data was stored in uncompressed format. This meant the dungeons ran much faster. So fast, in fact, that according to Naka himself in an interview with Game Maestro in 2000, it was like a roller coaster, and people that he showed it to said they would get dizzy and feel motion sickness. The compression was actually necessitated due to storage space. It used the largest ROM size available at the time, which was 4 megabits or half a megabyte, but despite that, it used 75% of the total capacity, which didn't leave a lot of room for everything else. As it turned out, implementing decompression like this also had the side effect of slowing the game down, making it less vomit-inducing and a more pleasant playing experience. I'll leave a link to a copy of the full interview with Naka translated into English in the description if you're interested. To further save on space, the game is also making use of the Master System's ability to flip background tiles. Only the tiles in the top left quadrant are displaying as normal. The tiles in the top right quadrant are horizontally flipped. The tiles in the bottom left are vertically flipped, and the tiles in the bottom right are both horizontally and vertically flipped. There's one more thing to cover about this, and that's the confusion about whether the dungeons are actually using real 3D, specifically 3D wireframes. As we've been able to see by deconstructing the tiles, that's not the case. They are in 2D and made to look 3D by being set up like a 2-point perspective drawing and utilising gradually darker colours to make them appear as though they have depth. So where did the confusion start? I think some of it comes from this interview with game designer Riko Kodama, originally posted on Sega's Japanese site in 2003, though SMS Power has a full English translation which I'll also link to in the description. In this interview, Kodama says that Naka wrote a wireframe 3D dungeon program, which allowed her to place art on top of the wireframes, and she specifically mentions, how about we make a wireframe 3D dungeon in the program itself? It bears mentioning that Kodama also says here that they had to experiment to figure out which frames of the animation they could drop while still keeping it looking smooth and pretty. This certainly could be interpreted to mean that the game is actually using a real-time wireframe under all that, with the artwork placed on top of it. However, I think this interview with the development team from 1993 in the World of Phantasy Star book clears this up. Again, the original was in Japanese, but has been fully translated to English, and I'll leave a link in the description for you. What Kodama says in this interview is that they will get an image of the dungeon in their head and draw them out on paper, but there were little details that bugged them and it wasn't getting across to the programmers as they had envisioned it. When Yuji Naka learned about this, he wrote them a wireframe 3D imaging program for them to use. So if we put these two interviews together, we can conclude that the way it actually happened was that Naka developed a separate program for the designers that drew the dungeons in wireframe, which they were then able to use to place art on top of in order to visualize the designs of dungeons to the programmers. Once they had done that, it was translated over to the game, with the tiles that were selected for the animations determined by the designers based on their experiments in Naka's program. At least that's my conclusion from all this, but let me know in the comments if you have other thoughts. We've covered a couple of Mega Drive games by Treasure in previous videos, including Gunstar Heroes and McDonald's Treasureland Adventure, so let's cover another one that viewers have left questions about, and that's Dynamite Headdy. Mr. Sonic 93, Buttered Toits, and Dret D all want to know how the rotating boss called Spinderella works. Before we get to that, you'll see a question also asks about the tower levels leading up to this boss, and to answer that, I'll direct you over to the channel Coding Secrets that has a video I'll link in the description that explains how it was done in Mickey Mania, as it's the same effect being used here. So onto Spinderella, and this is what the fight looks like in-game. At first glance, it looks quite similar to the guard device fight in Gunstar Heroes that we looked at a few videos ago, but there's even more going on here than there was in that example. The foreground platform moves in this case, and so does the background platform. And periodically during the fight, the boss spins it around, so you're now in the background. In order to defeat the boss, you need to wait for it to stop attacking and get its arm stuck, then walk left or right to access its back where the weak point is. When you're in the background, you can't actually see if you have the weak point lined up exactly, so you need to take your best educated guess. Spinderella itself is a large sprite, animated to do the rotation effect, and its arms are the same technique we saw Gunstar Heroes using, where they are made up of balls of varying sizes that change as they get closer or farther away. However, what's going on with the background scrolling in this fight is utterly unhinged. It's like they looked at the scrolling they did for Gunstar Heroes and thought, you know what, let's go even crazier, and it's basically all entirely happening on one plane too, plane A. Firstly, you've got what we'll call the back wall, the part that's got the cloud pattern on it. This alone is scrolling in 4 separate sections, each at a different speed. Then you have the far platform scrolling in one direction, the underside of the close platform scrolling in the opposite direction, and the floor of that close platform doing individual line scrolling to create a depth effect that we often see in fighting games. All of that is happening on plane A, so what's plane B doing? Well, see that pillar that sometimes passes by the very foreground of the screen? That's the only thing on that plane, but it's doing its bit to add to the effect as it scrolls past. The pillar that you see passing by in the background isn't part of either background plane, it's actually a sprite. There's so much going on here that the hardware actually struggles to keep up with it at times. If you look closely, you'll see some of the sprite tiles flickering or disappearing occasionally as the game exceeds the scanline sprite limit. Despite that little hiccup, the end result is truly spectacular. Next on the list for this video is Mega Turrican. I've previously talked about some aspects of this game in my Shadow and Highlight video, as well as covered some Super Nintendo Factor 5 games in my Mode 7 video, but this is about something totally different that I haven't investigated before. Flavia Tatiana 1953, FU102, and MLOD6Zapnix 7684, sorry if I made a mess of that name, all had the same question. How is the sprite rotation and scaling done? Because as we know, the Mega Drive had no hardware for rotation or scaling. Unfortunately, none of these questions provided any examples, but the logo on the title screen does it, and there's some examples in the first level of the game, so we'll use those. We'll start with the rotating, and one such enemy that does this are these bug things that you can encounter in the first level that curl up into a ball and roll back and forth. It's an incredibly smooth looking effect, and doesn't seem like it's something that should be possible with just standard sprite animation. Onto the scaling, about halfway through the level, you descend on an elevator and these giant bugs come flying at you out of the background and scale very smoothly, with the game actually scaling up to 3 of them at once. The final boss of the level is this mutated mass of something, and it also has some neat scaling tricks happening with the mouth and eyeballs that grow out of it and shrink back down, once again with multiple happening at the same time. And lastly, the Turrican logo on the title screen vertically flips back and forth, but also scales as it does so. This one's unique to the others as it's actually a background layer rather than sprites, and it's doing that flipping effect by utilising vertical stretching and contracting raster effects that we've seen a few times in past videos. There are other examples in the game, but I think this is enough to work with. If we take a look at the tiles, we can see they are individually animated in order to achieve all these effects, but the animations are so smooth they couldn't possibly be storing every single frame in the ROM, right? I studied this for quite some time, but I really wasn't sure exactly what was happening. So I reached out to someone who would be sure. Co-founder of Factor 5 and producer for the game, Julian Eggebrecht. He confirmed that Mega Turrican did indeed use sprite rotation and scaling for some enemies in the title logo. It's fully done in real time on the CPU. Their earlier games were made on the Amiga, which used the same Motorola 68000 CPU that the Mega Drive used, for the record, and when they moved over to the Mega Drive, they found they had a lot of CPU left over. This was probably as a result of the Mega Drive's tile-based architecture, which the Amiga was not designed around. So they made good use of that leftover power to write a software-based scaling and rotation solution. He name-dropped Thomas Engel as the engineer that was responsible for it. Interestingly, he went on to say that Thomas ported his sprite scaling engine over to the Super Nintendo for the game Indiana Jones' Greatest Adventures, and some of the enemies and objects use it. So there's another cool little piece of trivia for you all. A huge thank you to Julian for responding to my query and confirming the wizardry that's going on in the code behind this game. It's time to tackle a game that's had quite a few questions submitted, and that's Earthworm Jim 2. Most of these questions are asking about the Mega Drive version, but I think it'll be interesting to compare these effects with the Super Nintendo version to see how they differ. To start with, El Apache and Pierre Gombourd Art would both like me to take a look at the Puppy Love levels to see how the background was done. So let's dig into it. So this is what the Puppy Love levels look like on Mega Drive. They're basically mini games where you need to bounce the dogs from one side of the screen to the other, and there's some interesting parallaxing going on to make a kind of 3D effect in the background. This isn't anywhere near as crazy as what we saw earlier in the video with Dynamite Headdy, but it's interesting nonetheless. The clouds in the sky split into 6 different segments that are all scrolling at different speeds. The ground is using line scrolling in much the same way we saw earlier, with the scanlines representing the part of the background in the distance, scrolling left or right slower than the scanlines up close. The mountains in the distance actually don't scroll at all. The Super Nintendo version does basically the same thing, but enhances the effect by adding a red sun that can be seen through the clouds, which are now translucent, taking advantage of the subscreen and color math circuit to do so. They are also used to create shadows in front of the buildings that dynamically change Jim's shading as he moves in and out of them. They possibly could have done something similar to this latter effect on the Mega Drive using the shadow and highlight mode, but opted not to. Pierre Gombourd Art also had a question regarding the level Lorenzen Soil. He says he's been wondering how the crumbling ground effect was done. Let's continue digging to see what we can find. So this is the level he's asking about on Mega Drive. The main gimmick of this is that you need to shoot at the soil in various places during the level to blast it away and clear a path forward, and the question is referring to how that crumbling effect is done. It's an interesting question because there's a few aspects to this. The little bits of dirt that fall as you shoot them are indeed sprites, and they are just being drawn on screen when needed. That's not really the compelling part of this though, because not only can you blast a path through the soil, but as you blast away the dirt above you, it actually piles up underneath you as it falls, which is the only way you can reach some higher areas, and is also used to defeat some enemies and remove some obstacles. Both planes are combining together in a unique way to achieve this result. If we take a look at plane A, the foreground plane, we can see it looks a little weird. There's lots of transparent space on it, and as far as the soil is concerned, only the edges of it that Jim can walk on seem to be drawn onto this layer. So where's the rest of it coming from? It's coming from plane B, the background plane, which looks like this. Yeah, that's all it looks like. It's just a dirt texture, and you can see it's what's being used for the background, but it's also what's being used in the foreground on the soil that you can blast away. It's just shaded a different colour. You'll notice there actually isn't any parallaxing going on between the background and foreground in this level. It's all moving as one unit. In order to produce the mechanic of blasting soil away and having it pile up, the foreground plane is being updated to change where the transparent tiles are placed and the brighter yellowish spots are placed on the edges. It doesn't look like that dirt texture is the same layer, but it absolutely is. For the record, the Super Nintendo version works exactly the same way, except the subterranean effect is enhanced by utilising a third layer that is placed onto the subscreen, and colour subtraction is applied in order to darken the screen and create a spotlight effect that follows Jim around. Finally, Atomic Shroom asks a question about the level See Jim Run, Run Jim Run, and how the big glass orbs in the background have a neat light particle deformation/rotation effect. The comment mentions the Super Nintendo version too, so we'll compare them both like we did with the previous queries. Let's dig down even deeper to uncover these secrets. So here's the level we are examining, and we are specifically studying that effect we see in those domes in the background and how there's a moving light effect on them. It's a really neat look they have created with this that really sells them being kind of mirrored domes that are reflecting light. Once again, the background and foreground plane are combining here in a unique way. The foreground contains the domes, which might appear to be entirely black at first glance, but if we turn transparent pixels on, you can see they have transparent concentric rings on them. The background plane contains an odd pattern comprised of circles or parts of circles in various sizes, and the game is constantly scrolling this layer up, down, left and right. It also follows the player's movement like the foreground does. On the Super Nintendo, it's done more or less the same way, except the rings in the background layer are additionally constantly cycling colours to enhance the effect. The Mega Drive certainly could have done this too, so I'm not entirely sure why they decided not to do it. You'll notice here that the Nintendo version has way more environment detail than the Sega version does, and also parallaxing between the foreground parts Jim runs on and the background. This is a result of the SNES having more layers to play with. In order to achieve the dome effect, the Mega Drive version needed to use the background plane, resulting in the back wall and front platforms being on the same layer, so they scroll together. The Super Nintendo didn't have this restriction, so the front platforms were on their own separate layer, allowing it to scroll independently of the back wall with the domes on it. If you've been playing at home, how did you go guessing all that? Did you get it all right? I think Earthworm Jim 2 is a remarkable looking game on either console. The way they manipulated the hardware to do what this game does was really something special. The character art and animation also looks like it was ripped straight out of Looney Tunes. You do need to admit though that the Super Nintendo version does a little more and looks the better of the two. This is why I love digging into games like this, because you discover some seriously creative solutions. It's also why I appreciate you guys leaving questions in the comments so much, because I get to look into games and investigate tricks that I might not have ever thought about myself. We'll finish this video off with Mario Paint, as Mr. Nuage and Butler128 both had a question relating to this game. As we know, the Super Nintendo was a tile-based console, just like most of the others at the time. So if that's the case, how is Mario Paint seemingly able to allow you to draw pictures on the canvas pixel by pixel? Really good question, and for the record, this also covers the Super Game Boy's drawing tools as well, so let's channel our inner Bob Ross to take a look at the whole picture. So yeah, Mario Paint. It's a pretty well-known title, and while it's not much of a game in the strictest sense, except for containing a weird fly swatting thing, it is a pretty robust and easy to use set of image editing tools that utilise the Super Nintendo mouse. It was pretty revolutionary for the time, and was one of the first of its kind, especially on a console. It even had a music editor. The main draw of it, and yes that pun was very much intended, is that you can create pictures of basically anything you want, including being able to make animations to a limited degree. But if the tiles are stored in and read from the ROM, how is it allowing you to paint pictures like this with pixel precision? That should be impossible, right? Clearly they can't be storing every single tile the player could possibly create in the ROM, so something else is happening in the background. Firstly, the game always runs in mode 1, with 3 background layers available. Layer 1 contains the border around the canvas, including the colour and pattern selector at the top and the various tools at the bottom. Layer 2 contains the canvas itself. Layer 3 is a bit strange, as it doesn't seem to really be utilised except for showing the score in the fly swatting minigame. The only sprites you see during regular operation are the various different cursors, which include the stamps until you place them down, although they are also used for the notes in the music editor. So layer 2 is where it's all happening. Let's take a look at the tiles that are stored in the video RAM for that layer, and without any kind of image on the screen, we can see it's all completely white. Makes sense? But as we draw something, the relevant tiles dynamically change. Remember, what we are looking at here are the tiles that are currently stored in the VRAM. RAM, or Random Access Memory, can actually be modified, unlike ROM, or Read-Only Memory, which can't be modified by definition. So the game is loading in a bunch of blank white tiles from the ROM into VRAM, then editing those tiles as needed. The Super Nintendo had 64 kilobytes of VRAM, which was more or less enough to fill the whole screen, although keep in mind some of that is used for the tools, palette and sprites. This explains why it's quite slow when using the fill tool. Mario Paint actually only uses 16 colours for your creations. Layer 2, which contains the canvas, uses palette 0, and that's the only one it uses. Well, technically it's not even 16 colours. If you count them at the top there, you'll notice there's only 15. That's because white appears in the canvas palette twice, and the rest of the palettes are used for other stuff like icons and menus. Even if you change the game's pattern at the top of the screen, all of the possible patterns and images all use some combination of these 15 or 16 colours, even though the Super Nintendo was capable of displaying way more than that. I'm guessing this was a deliberate decision in order to limit the size of the image in the VRAM and the save file size. Speaking of saving, Mario Paint had a battery-backed SRAM to save one creation on the cartridge at a time, but it was only 32 kilobytes in size, so it actually had some relatively simple compression implemented to save the data, which is part of the reason why it takes so long to save. It is actually possible, albeit unlikely, to make an image that is actually too large to save, resulting in a data overflow error and a unique animation for the save robot. Some of you might have put 2 and 2 together at this point and might be thinking, so there actually isn't very much data stored on the cartridge then, is there? And you'd be right. The whole game is a pretty tiny 4 megabits or just half a megabyte in size. So there you go, that's how Mario Paint and the Super Game Boy allowed you to draw your own images. To conclude this video, I have a bit of a bonus for those of you who have made it to the end. I'm actually a musician, as you might have deduced from this drum kit behind me, and I also have a piano keyboard just over there out of shot. So I decided to use the Mario Paint music composition tool to recreate some video game music. Now I did cheat a little bit because I needed access to sharps and flats, and the Super Nintendo original doesn't provide that. So I used Mario Paint Composer, which was a tool that was made for PCs that was based on the Mario Paint engine that added some additional functionality. So enjoy the music and see if you can guess what game it's from. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video, it really helps a lot, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching and see you next time.